I'd like to welcome our next speakers. One of our very own Ontario Bat Network committee members is Derek Morningstar from Star. So welcome, Derek.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Okay. All right. So I'm glad to follow Charles and Mike because my talk is quite related to what they're doing, some work that we're doing together. I came to the federal government and I said, we don't have any kind of organization for bats that are marked in Canada or in North America or anywhere. It's not coordinated at all. I said, maybe we can come up with a way to solve this. So that's what this talk's going to all be about, but I'm going to give you a little bit of background first. So, of course, to mark a bat, you have to catch it first. So when you're in Ontario, catching a bat requires a lot of paperwork ahead of time. There's a lot of permits that you need. It starts with an animal care protocol, which if you're at a university, you might get that through your university, and then it's accepted at other levels. If not, it's the provincial one. If you're getting federal permits, then you have to get a federal approval of your animal care, and that's before you apply for any of your capture permits, and that can take months. And then if you're on private land anywhere, you need to get a wildlife scientific collector's authorization from the MNR. That might be from your district office, it might be from the regional office, it changes depending what you're doing, it might be location specific, it might not. Then you also need to register with the MECP for the activity you're doing with the specific date and location. And then if you're on Ontario Park, you need a permit from them. If you're on a conservation authority, you need a permit from them. Other private land, you might need permits from them. If you're working on federal land, I do a lot of work on federal land and with First Nations. Then you're a whole different system. Then you're under the Species at Risk Act permit system, and you have to get permits from the federal government, and they make you go through the whole thing again. And then at the end of it all, you may also have to report back to NHIC. So that's a giant long list of all the permits you need to get if you just want to catch and handle a bat. And then I'm introducing a whole other one. It seems like it's more complicated, but the idea is to try and bring this together and make it just a little bit more organized. So once you get your capture permits, there you go. You get to go out and catch bats. So you have to demonstrate to all those people that you're qualified enough and you have the experience and you have the equipment, you can go out and do it. And then you get the fun and usually really hard part is catching the bats because it's a lot of effort. You get to some really cool spots, use some new techniques. We're going to be hosting a training course this summer on how to do some of these things. I won't talk more about that. But anyways, once you catch all these bats, then you finally get to put marks on them. So for most people, they think of forearm bands. That's the most common way that bats are marked. Of course, they used to use leg bands from birds and put them on the forearms of bats. Those were considered to cause damage, so they're not used very often anymore. Now there's specialized ones that are lipped, usually from Porzana in the UK. But there's other manufacturers. Some people use PIT tags, passive implanted transponder tags. Those are commonly used as well. That goes under the skin of a bat, but you need special readers to pick up that bat, so you can't see it. So if you found that bat on the ground, you wouldn't know it had a PIT tag in it unless you scanned it. But they're common for very specific purposes for counting bats and movement. There's older methods like necklaces or collars. They're not used much here. They're used in South America and Central America historically. I don't know of anybody still using them. And then there's newer things that I think Shane talked about last year with P-chips. They're pretty cool. You can ask him about those. And things called winger prints, which is basically mapping their wing. And there's all kinds of other new ways to mark bats that are coming out. So we didn't want to say this is a banding database because that's only one way. And each different project has different reasons for why they're going to mark bats. So this is a more general kind of database that we wanted to create, but it's for permanent marks. So some people put radio transmitters on and chase bats around. That's fun too, but those transmitters fall off. So this is not for radio transmitters. But this database is not about debating why you should use any one method or what works or what doesn't or how to do it. That's up to you and your animal care protocols and things like that. We're just trying to track the marks that are out there. So what happens when you finish your work and you send your report to all those gazillion agencies that needed a permit? What happens to those reports? As we all know, they kind of, who knows where they go? They just disappear. It's magic. But those reports all have different, so they might have asked for certain specifics of what you marked a bat with or just how many you caught. They might ask for something else. It's not standardized across all the different agencies. They're asking for different stuff. And then where does it end up? Like you email it to somebody. Where does it go into one place that somebody else is going to get to it? And can they access it if somebody called up, the ministry and said, I have a bat with a number on it, and would they know? So it's not clear that that would happen. Also, bats, of course, they fly across borders. So they might be coming from the US. They might be coming from another province. So we needed this coordination between all the different areas. So if you capture a marked bat, what do you do? So And you might be somebody who's out there catching lots of bats, and so there's a good chance you'll have an on-project recapture, which is your own bat. You went to a roost last year, you marked a bunch of bats, and you went again this year. Okay, you know what to do with that. That's easy. You're designed for that. That's a mark recapture program. No problem. But what if you catch a bat that's marked by somebody else? And that has happened. Some of my bats have been caught by other people. And then what do you do? So that's an off-project recapture. The bat may have moved, or it may be a new person. So how do you find out who that is? Or if you pick one up that's sick and it gets turned into a rehabber or at a wind farm, what do? There isn't a place to go find that out. You probably contact your local government representative. They may or may not know who to call. Or this wonderful bat network, you might send out an email. Maybe that'll find it, but there's still no repository. So what do they do for birds? Okay, lots of us know about bird banding program, right? It's famous, right? It's all centralized by the CWS. No matter where you are, you get designated as a master bander or a sub-permitted bander. That can take a lot of years to get figured out. It's very strict. They have all these protocols. All the reporting goes back to them. It's very centralized. You have to give them a ton of detail, and they have secure management of that data. So it's a pretty good system, but it's been going for over 100 years. But the other thing that's also important is they have a website. If you Google bird banding, you'll get this website, and it'll tell you all about it, and it'll give you contact information to say, hey, I found this bird, and you can find out where that was banded. We don't have that in Canada, so we're trying to make the Canadian Bat Marks database. So the whole point here is that I'm not a government employee, it's funded by government, but the idea of this is that this is a database for our community that we're going to build together, right? We want something that works for us and will work across jurisdictions. So the main purpose is, of course, what the government likes to see and what Mike likes to see is, okay, we're going to track where are bats being marked across Canada, not at pinpoint locations, but at a broader scale. Where across the country are each species being marked and what species and how often. Those are high-level statistics, not details. And then, of course, a database that we can go to if we have a recaptured bat and find out where it came from. And the idea isn't that those of us running the database get to publish your recapture information. It's to connect you. So if you found a bat, we'll connect you with the person who caught it in the first place. And you two can coordinate and figure out what you're going to do about that. So we broke down a bunch of steps. These are not necessarily in chronological order, but we wanted to know from the community, what do we want? So we had a poster at NASBR last year, and I've been emailing and talking to all kinds of people to try and get an idea of what does our community want in a database like this, and establish a connection between the government. Mike was just talking about that. It was a great question. So we're trying to connect with provincial governments to see, okay, how can they contribute? How can we work together so that everybody can use this together? And then we wanted to build a template that's very simple, that's easy, that has the basic information that people can fill out with their data, and then find a home for it. So that was a little bit challenging. We looked at a few different places to store the data and to have a home for it. And hand in hand is to get a plan for data security and confidentiality, because I know, even with my own data, you don't just send it anywhere. You want to know that it's going to be in a secure place and no one's going to take that data and publish on you. So and then, of course, we start playing catch-up. Bats have been banded since the 60s, and then there was a big gap when they weren't banded, and then they're being banded a lot again, and pit-tagged and everything else now. So we're trying to get all that data from a long time ago and catch up a little bit. And then we wanted to try and advise on the people who issue those permits so that they can come up with conditions that say, now you can put your data going forward into this database. So what did our community say? Everybody said, yes, do it, we need to do it, but hold on, I don't want to give you all my data. So there was a resounding, we want it, we need the database, but then we had to kind of establish, okay, what's the minimum that we can ask for across the country that's useful for this kind of a thing? So we kind of broke it down to the minimum. There was lots of issues, concerns about data access and stuff like that. And then it should be a broad scope, which is what we're doing. Canada-wide, it'll link a little bit to the US. We can access each other's kind of thing. I already mentioned we wanted to make connections between governments. So there's 3 provinces that already have their own provincial database with a lot of detail in it. So we want to be able to take the bits of that detail and feed up into the federal database. So there's one place to go. And they've all agreed to do that. We don't have the data yet, but it's agreed. And then Ontario is working on a database like that. So it's not there yet, but we're getting there, I think. All right, so this is basically the spreadsheet. I won't go over too much, but there's 5 key things. Who are you that banded it? When did you band it, and where, approximately where? I'm going to talk more about that. Some basic things about what species it was, and the information about the pit tag or the band or whatever you used. So we decided to go with the NABAT program to house the data. So there was a few that we looked at, and as both Charles and Mike mentioned, it really makes sense to go with NABAT. They sort of have a capture tracking template. We're modifying that a little bit. And it's just a really good spot to use it because it's continental, right? So we created a Canadian bat marks database within the NABAT framework, which is where all the data will be put, and we got the standards put together. We haven't uploaded the data to it just yet, but we're getting there. I'm rushing through. And of course, with NABAT, there is already a data sharing and confidentiality agreement that's there. So that will hopefully help with a lot of people that were like, well, I don't know how you're going to protect my data, so they haven't sent it yet. This lists exactly what protection will be there. So the thing that people are worried about the most is I don't want anyone to know where I caught that bat, where my capture locations are. That's understandable. Like, that's private property usually. You don't want to, share that broadly for people to know. So this is what they use is called the GRITS squares, which was sort of introduced. So it's a 10 by 10 kilometer square, similar to birding data and NHIC. So if we were here at Algonquin College, this is the square that would show up. So we caught a bat here, we marked it. That's the square that shows where it was. Can you tell exactly where we were from that? Probably not. So it's an obscure location that protects people's actual capture locations, but it's enough that when you start looking at the provincial scale, you can start to see these dots, and you can use that for status and trends. These are actually acoustic squares with data. I was cheating a little, but this is the kind of high level you can get to say, a particular species was found in these squares and captured and marked. Okay, so what have we done so far? We have about 8,000 records across the country so far. Right from BC to British Columbia. We don't have anything in the territories yet. Over a 10-year span, most of it's Ontario, of course, because there's been a lot of work done in Ontario. And there's lots of people who have offered the data and are just trying to work on getting it together, because some of them have like tens of thousands of records for individual researchers in some places. So we're still trying to get it all together into that template. And we're also connecting, as I mentioned, to those 3 provincial databases that exist. So that's all in progress. And then we're going to start loading that onto the NABAT project soon. But of course, everybody can't just go on and find the capture locations, as I mentioned. You can look at it at a high level. We can make statistics at a high level, but the data itself is protected. And then we're also going to try and work on a contacts page similar to what the bird banding program has, so that people know where to go and find out about marked bats and who they can talk to. So I've gone past my time, so I will stop there and take any questions.
If you have a question for Derek, you just want to raise your hand, I'll bring the mic over.
Charles, of course.
Thanks, Derek. I probably have lots more questions for afterwards, but just a quick one now. You mentioned obscured locations. Is the idea to store the actual location but only release the obscured location, or to only store the obscured location?
Excellent question. Comes up a lot. So there's the option for both. So with the NABAT template, there's 2 required fields. They need to have the GRITS square and a location name, which you could call it ABC1. It doesn't matter. It's arbitrary, right? That's just how they organize it. So the GRITS square number is the number for the square, not your lat long. But if you give the lat long, it will come up with the GRITS square, and it will only show the GRITS square. So you can give the detailed information and put it in the database, but nobody in the public can see that, only the managers of the database. And it can be used to automatically calculate the GRITS square. I also went too fast through it, but there's Bat Conservation International has a website where you can input a whole spreadsheet full of lat longs, and it'll tell you the GRITS squares too.
I would just encourage that you try to get people to give the exact information, because in the future that could well be valuable, even if it's not what's being released. But I don't want to take more time.
Okay.
I also had a question about the grid squares. Just because we have say you're like in Southern Ontario, and the availability of, say, a research maternity habitat for an endangered species is pretty, just there's very few of them, right? Is a 10 by 10 square really large enough to say, oh, we don't know it's there, when maybe there's only like 1 tree patch or like 1 cave or in that certain area, right? And also, are the grid squares centered around the site? Because if it's on the edge,
No.
or it's just randomly within it?
No, it's a standardized grid that's already there. So you could be at the very eastern corner of the square where your
like the
actual
NABAT
location
grid,
is,
yeah.
and not the center. Like it's anywhere in that square.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So that's a debate. Is 10 kilometers enough? I'm not the one to answer that question, but I know that the 10 kilometer grid square is what's used pretty consistently. Like NHIC, for every endangered species, you get a 10-kilometer grid square. So that's kind of how it's already managed, and so that's why we tried to adopt that to be consistent. So it already exists as a grid system that any bat came up with, well, from other things. So, yeah.
We still have 3 minutes if anyone else has a question.
I've had the pleasure of working with the British Columbia database. I'm just curious, how close is Ontario? Is it something they should be excited for? And the second part of this question, NHIC, is there any interest in linking the two systems so we have a bad kind of database that's publicly accessible with all the other data we have?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, and that's a challenge. So, like, all of the provincial databases, and the BC one in particular, they collect a lot more. So when people submit data, it's like 4R measurements, it's mass, it's all kinds of other things, like a whole giant long list of information that they put in their database. We're not putting that into the federal database. So the idea is that we have kind of the simplest database that's the farthest reaching. The most important thing is to connect the two people that might have caught a bat. And then those two people will have much more detailed information. But all of the stats on, like, okay, what's the average mass and all those things, we're not doing any of that with the federal database. That's left to the provinces. If they want to do that, that's how they do that. Because as we talked about, like, managing bats is kind of a provincial jurisdiction. This is to try and link everything together. So you're absolutely right. And then NHIC, that's an even more challenging one because it's not just for bats, right? So, and they don't collect this information specifically. They don't have I just sent my NHIC data. They don't have what's your bat band's number. They don't have that, so it's hard to link to that. And NHIC, it could just be an observation. I saw a bat fly by and I thought it was a little brown, and so I put it in NHIC. You know, they have a lot of different types of data, so it's hard to tease out, like, the marking data from NHIC. So, yeah.
I have another question here for you, Derek.
Because they are managed at a provincial level, are the squares set up in a way that they respect provincial guideline boundaries, or will you have a square that's half in Ontario, half in Quebec, and you won't be able to tell if the bat is in Ontario or Quebec?
Haven't tackled that one yet, but the answer is the grid is a nationwide. It's the Canada grid. It's a nationwide grid, even goes out into the ocean. So no, there's probably lots of squares that are on, you know, across Quebec and Ontario, and it won't. So I should say it won't. One of the other fields that we asked for is what province was it caught in. That's within the database, but not something that you could pull out looking at it publicly. So that will exist a little further down, I guess, for people. The managers would say, okay, this many bats were caught in Ontario, and I know it might be a challenge if it was just the square, but we should be able to tease out which province they were from. So I think I answered that in two different ways, but yes and no. How's that? Was there another question? Or? Okay, thank you.